Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of The Advance. I'm Brandon Walton, Senior Editor at Texas Scorecard. And you notice I'm here by myself. Michael's not here. He's out on assignment. He actually said, why not just take the day off? But I said, no, we've got to give people the advance because we've got a big week happening in the legislature. We're 49 days into this legislative session, or 50 days since January 14th. Either way you slice it, we're more than a third of the way through the legislative session, and we're starting to see some activity happening in the House. Now, certainly over the past several weeks, we've talked about what the Senate has been doing. The Senate has been passing some legislation. Just last week, for example, they passed a ban on online lottery couriers. They've already passed school choice, property tax relief. A number of issues have been making their way through the chamber. You've got the House, which has been about a month or so behind the curve, but now you're starting to see some legislation actually brought up in committees and some committees that are scheduled for this week. We're going to talk about some of those coming up, starting with education in the House. Now, as we speak right now, the Texas House is meeting to discuss House Bill 2, which is essentially a school finance bill that gives additional money to schools. Now, it's notable that the House is debating this bill before what we would probably think is the bigger education bill, at least in terms of what we've seen as a priority from Governor Greg Abbott and something that's been talked about over the last several years, and that is school choice. But don't fear, the House is hearing their school choice proposal on Thursday. Well, at least part of it. So on Thursday, the Texas House Committee on Education is going to be meeting to discuss House Bill 3. That is the House's school choice proposal. It's largely similar to the version that passed out of the Senate. Certainly, some have had some criticisms with it. We won't get into that. But either way, however you feel about that legislation, the House Public Education Committee is going to be taking up that bill and hearing testimony on it on Thursday from invited testimony. Now, what's the difference between invited testimony and public testimony? Essentially, invited testimony is exactly as the name would suggest. It's people that are invited specifically to come as subject matter experts. They're invited by members of the committee, by the chair of the committee, by the bill's author, whoever, to come and testify. And so on Thursday, we expect to hear from school choice advocates who are going to be invited to say why they want to see House Bill 3 pass. We might even see some invited testimony maybe from even folks in the TEA, other folks like that. That's what's going to happen on Thursday. But if you're wanting to come down and testify and have your 2 cents put in on the legislation, Thursday's not going to be the day because they're not going to be taking public testimony. Instead, that's going to come on Tuesday, March 11th. That's when public testimony is going to happen, meaning anybody can come down to the Capitol, you can sign up, and you can speak. Usually they'll limit the time for something like this. It might be limited to 2 or 3 minutes per person. And you can actually speak to the committee, tell them what you like about House Bill 3, what you don't like about it. That's when that public testimony is going to take place. It's interesting that they decided to split this into 2 different hearings. This isn't very common. Normally, you would have your invited testimony and your public testimony all happening at the same time. But that's not what the House is deciding to do on this school choice legislation. Meanwhile, in the Senate today, the Senate Education Committee is going to be hearing a couple of bills dealing with religion and public schools, namely Senate Bill 10, which would put the 10 Commandments into public school classrooms, SB 10, well named, and SB 11, which deals with bringing the Bible and prayer into classrooms. These are by Senators Phil King and Mays Middleton, respectively. Their low numbers, the fact that they're 10 and 11, indicates that they are priorities for Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. Anytime you see a low number bill, especially 40 or below in either the House or the Senate, that means it's a priority of either the Speaker of the House in the House or the Lieutenant Governor in the Senate. And so that's going to be heard in the Education Committee today. You've already seen, by the way, the Senate committees get to some work earlier this week, yesterday rather, State Affairs, for example, passing out legislation dealing with drag queen story hours in public libraries. That's something they heard testimony on last week. They voted it out yesterday, as well as a ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying, which is, as you might recall, a priority of the Republican Party of Texas. So people are saying they have had enough of organizations, either taxpayer-funded organizations like, I don't know, the Texas Association of School Boards, for example, using tax dollars to come down to Austin and lobby against the interests of citizens. By the way, we might even see some of that when it comes to the school choice testimony and committee hearings that we're going to have over the next several days. Also happening right now in the legislature, you look at the House committees in particular, you'll notice that there's a lot of committees that have scheduled to meet this week. And if they're not meeting this week, they're likely to start up next week. But if you go and look in, you're wondering, well, what bills are they going to be looking at? Most of the committees right now that are meeting the House are having what are called organizational meetings. We've talked a little bit about organizational meetings. Essentially what these are, they are the first meetings that a committee will have where they often don't have any testimony on specific bills at all. Instead, they bring in expert testimony to talk about the subject at large. So, for example, a higher education committee might have some of the heads from the university systems come in and testify. A committee on public health will have people come in from certain Texas health departments and testify, giving broad testimony over the subject matter, but not talking about specific bills. That's what we're referring to when we talk about an organizational meeting. And one of the meetings that I think is interesting that's going to be happening this week and is the meeting on Thursday in the Texas House of the DOGE Committee. Now, this is something I've gotten a lot of questions on. People have said, well, why doesn't Texas have a DOGE? They see what happens in DC. They've seen what Elon Musk has been able to do there. And they say, well, why don't we have a version of that in Texas? Now, there's a couple of interesting points to note on this. One is that the Texas House did create a DOGE committee. It's chaired by Giovanni Capriglione. However, there's a lot of people that look at this and say they're not as hopeful that we're going to see the same sort of effect like we saw in DC happen in Texas. And that's for, like I said, two reasons. One of them being that unlike the DC equivalent, this is essentially just another committee of the House, meaning it's made up entirely of lawmakers. I think what makes DOGE work in DC is that it's made up of outsiders, people like Elon Musk and his staff that have come in and taken an outside look at what's been happening in agencies. But the Texas DOGE Committee says they're going to do that. They're going to be looking through agencies, seeing where they can cut waste. So we'll see if they're able to do that. The other point is that Texas, by and large, already has a DOGE committee. It's called the Sunset Committee. If you don't know about the Sunset Committee, essentially state agencies and programs are set for sunset every 10 years or so. Sometimes they get moved around. Where a Sunset Committee made up of some legislators and some public members take a look, much like DOGE, at the committee, see where their spending is wasteful, where the programs can be trimmed down. In some cases, they even recommend entirely abolishing state agencies. Now, it's very rare, but it does happen. Unfortunately, what we've seen happen is just as often as they will recommend maybe that an agency be completely closed or folded into another agency, it's ultimately up to the legislature to take action on that. And what we've seen happen is that even with a recommendation by the sunset agency sometimes to actually close an agency, the legislature will still keep it going, will extend its sunset review process, and will continue giving money to it. And so will we see the same inaction from the Texas DOGE Committee? It remains to be seen. You've certainly seen some public citizens, people like Beau French, the county Republican chair in Tarrant County, posting just independently a series of findings that he's been trying to relay to the committee, to relay to Giovanni Capriglione, who is the chair, who is from Tarrant County. He says right now he hasn't had a lot of luck speaking and getting a meeting with Chairman Capriglione to talk about some of the wasteful finding that he's found in the government that potentially the Doge Committee could cut. But we'll see. We'll see if the Texas Doge Committee actually lives up to its name. Certainly a lot of skepticism around that. Now, I mentioned that it is the 49th day, that we're 49 days into this legislative session. In just a week and a half, on that 60th day, we've got a big deadline, because 60 days means a couple big things for people who are following the legislature. One, it's the deadline for filing legislation. So almost any bill idea you might have, maybe you think of something tomorrow or over the weekend, not very likely at this point that it's going to be drafted this legislative session. Already, members are telling me that Legislative Council, which is the group that writes a lot of the legislation, they're essentially the lawyers for the House that do the drafting of the bills, that they've been backed up, that they've had delays getting their bills drafted. And so that 60th day of the session, that's going to be the deadline for actually filing bills. Also on that 60-day deadline is another milestone. It's the time where it's now open season for any bills to be passed. And we've talked a lot about Abbott's emergency items. Those are the items he declared emergency, 7 or 8 items during the State of the State address early last month. And so for the first 60 days of the session, lawmakers were limited to only passing legislation dealing with those items by and large, unless they suspended the constitutional rule that prohibits that, like they did actually in the Senate with the lottery courier bill. But by and large, they were limited to those items. And so those were things like school choice, like property taxes, etc. Now with that 60 days, when that 60-day milestone is past us, they will be able to pass any bill, which means there will be no more excuses that lawmakers can use for not working and starting to pass those things. Now, there's still plenty of time to pass legislation. We're certainly, like I said, we're more than a third of the way through the session, but we still got several months here. We're still going to see committees really fire up, really start to hopefully meet in the House. You're seeing bills begin to be referred to committees, which is a first step in the process of them actually being able to be heard in committees. And we're going to see what comes out of the House. Certainly, the Speaker of the House seems optimistic for some issues like school choice. You've already got a majority of members that have signed on to that school choice proposal in the House. But what about the other priorities of the Republican Party of Texas? What about things like banning taxpayer-funded lobbying? Is that something that can get through the House? It's already passed the Senate 3 times previously. Will it get through the House? We'll see. Will the chambers come to an agreement on property tax relief? Right now, they have 2 different opposing views. The Senate favoring a homestead exemption increase, while the House favoring a buy down of the school tax rate, or compression as it's sometimes called. Will they be able to come to an agreement on that issue? And will they come to an agreement on issues like ending the purchase of Texas land by hostile foreign entities? The Senate passed legislation that would have done that last session in 2023. The House killed it. Will the House kill that again? That remains to be seen. But these are some of the issues that we're going to be watching. Like I said, it's starting to become a little bit busier this week. We're going to see it hopefully become even busier next week as committees start meeting. We're going to be following all of it at TexasScorecard.com. Thank you for joining.